My office is independent of other federal organizations, including Public Service and Procurement Canada. I submit an annual report to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, but the Minister has no influence over the results of my reviews or reports, and all my activities are conducted at arm's length from PSPC and other federal organizations.
Independent organization, my legislative mandate includes the review of procurement practices of federal departments to assess fairness, openness, and transparency and consistency with laws, policies, and guidelines, which is what we're here to discuss today. On February 3rd, 2023, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement requested that I conduct a review looking into contracts awarded to McKinsey & Company. Once my office was able to establish reasonable grounds as per our regulatory requirements, the review was launched on March 16, 2023. As per our legislative deadline, my office completed the review of McKinsey contracts on March 15, 2024, and the report was published on our website on April 15, 2024. My office examined the procurement files of 32 McKinsey contracts and one National Master Standing Offer, or NMSO, issued to McKinsey through competitive and non-competitive procurement processes to assess their fairness, openness, and transparency and their compliance with legislation, regulation, policy, and procedural requirements. PSPC was the contracting department for 23 contracts and the National Master Standing Offer. The review did not include contracts awarded by federal organizations that are not in my mandate, for example, contracts awarded to McKinsey by Crown corporations. With regards to competitive procurement practices leading to the award of contracts, my office identified instances where procurement strategies were changed to allow for McKinsey's participation in the procurement process, creating a perception of favoritism towards McKinsey. We also observed deficiencies related to bid evaluations in multiple files, including missing or incomplete documentation, failure to conduct evaluations as per planned approach, and the inappropriate re-evaluation of bids, leading to McKinsey being deemed the only compliant bid. My office also identified shortfalls related to personal security clearances, including lack of documentation to show that security clearances of proposed resources were verified before they were authorized to work, or to confirm that contracts were sent to PSPC's contract security program when required. With regards to non-competitive procurement practices leading to the award of contracts, my review found that the sole source justification used by PSPC to establish the McKinsey Benchmarking Services NMSO did not contain the required information needed to justify this sole source standing offer. 19 contracts known as call-ups with a total value of almost $49 million were issued to McKinsey without competition against this standing offer. We also found that the vast majority of call-ups issued against the McKinsey Benchmarking Services NMSO were void of any description of the specific work to be carried out by McKinsey and, by extension, proper PSPC oversight. In these files, there was no evidence on file that a statement of work had been developed in advance of determining the procurement strategy or contacting McKinsey with the requirement. In these cases, it was impossible for my office to determine the extent to which McKinsey defined the requirement for these departments, which is a serious threat to the fairness of the procurement process. All call-ups issued against the McKinsey Benchmarking Services NMSO were non-competitive. The majority of these call-ups also lacked sole source justifications. Sole source justifications were never sought by PSPC in its capacity as the contracting department. In total, 18 of the 19 competitive call-ups were awarded by PSPC in the absence of justification on file. We also noted conflicting information regarding the use of McKinsey Benchmarking Services NMSO for call-ups with security requirements. My office also examined practices for issuing contract amendments and task authorizations for McKinsey. Overall, contract amendments were appropriate and were in line with policy and guidelines, but several issues were noted, including an instance where the contract amendment was not on file, an instance where the contract amendment was not issued prior to contract expiry, and an instance where the call-up was amended to increase the value by nearly $2 million without a clear description of the changes to the scope of work. We also examined practices related to disclosure of contract awards. In most instances, necessary disclosures were made on the proactive disclosure website. However, we noted issues with respect to the accuracy of information. In total, there were 5 recommendations made by my office, which were all accepted by the implicated departments. It should also be noted that PSPC accepted most of the findings in the report but took issue with some observations. I would be pleased to discuss all of these matters with you. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thanks for your attention. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Now with Mrs. Cusi for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Yaglick and Monsieur Mercenot, for being with us here again today. I see that the 4 lines of inquiry, the first one being competitive procurement practices leading to contracts awarded to McKinsey, yet 78% of McKinsey contracts were sole sourced, and 59% of the contracts you reviewed were sole source contracts specifically under a benchmarking service deal catered towards McKinsey, correct?
Can't validate the statistics, but yes, it sounds accurate.
Thank you. So this specific benchmarking solution was originally valued at $47 million, but then increased to $48.8 million. And only one contract of the 19 provided any justification as to why McKinsey was the only company able to perform the necessary services. So this means $43 million was paid to McKinsey without the proper documentation, a theme we've seen repeatedly, unfortunately, across this government. Do you believe it's because the departments favor McKinsey as a company in comparison to others that perform similar services?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think in totality what we concluded, in addition to the NMSO, which you well described, we found instances of favoritism towards McKinsey. Now, the one counter to that is in the NMSO creation, as we reported in the report, there was also the creation of 4 other national master standing offers with other entities, not McKinsey.
So then why do you think it was that departments were changing their requirements to allow for McKinsey to bid on contracts that they were not originally eligible for?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So again, where there's a lack of documentation, we simply allege the facts, right? And I don't know if you recall, but at my previous testimony, I started to talk about negative inferences. At what point do we make negative inferences associated with the lack of documentation? And this report starts that trend of negative inferences where we allege the facts, but ultimately came to a conclusion that in some, there was favoritism towards McKinsey.
And what evidence did you find that encouraged this favoritism from government departments?
Well, so you've cited 2 examples. So one was in the change of procurement strategy. What we saw was there was a procurement strategy being contemplated, and then it was only through the realization, whether it be directly with McKinsey or through the contracting authority, that they would not be qualified to participate in the process, and therefore there was a reconsideration of the process. Now, could there have been additional factors in addition to that fact alone? Absolutely. And we're not discounting that, but we're simply saying that did happen, and the contracts were in fact awarded to McKinsey. And I just will say one more thing. In addition, we found a lack of documentation. So other ways that we could kind of walk back our findings were if we saw documentation which would explain why some of these decisions were taken. And you'll note in the report there was a lack of information explaining why there was a change of these decisions or procurement strategies.
Interesting, very similar to the Auditor General's findings around ArriveCan, that she was unable to actually determine the actual cost of ArriveCan as a result of missing documentation. The only contract that received a justification was challenged by PSPC. I believe the term that they used specifically was take issue. Words were take issue because it was not accurate and did not justify the exception. Did ESDC respond with the proper justification, or did they maintain their original justification?
The justification that's cited in the report is the only one we saw. We didn't see a subsequent, that might have been previously adjusted, but what we saw in the file is what's reflected in the report, and it provided inadequate justification in our view.
Thank you. To approve the contracts, PSPC had the Minister of Procurement personally sign off on this $5.7 million contract. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which minister signed off on this contract?
Minister Tassi.
Thank you. Is it standard practice for a minister to personally approve a contract that their own officials challenge?
So in this circumstance, we did look for the rationale as to why the minister signed off on this specific contract. So there is an internal delegation instrument, I believe, within the department that, based on the dollar value associated with the contract, required minister approval.
What justification would a minister possibly use or to have to sign off on a $5.7 million contract? Can you think of a justification that would be legitimate for where a minister could personally override their officials and sign off on a contract? Have you seen this before? And what would, if not, yes, when? And if not, what kind of justification could possibly be used for this type of authority?
So I will say the implication of any political actor in a procurement process is not ideal. Because it puts the political actor in a difficult position, whether approval or rejection of the recommendation to ultimately enter into the contract. That being said, the signature was provided based on the recommendation, and it was in line with the required delegations within the department. Beyond that, we have no additional insight specifically why that was done other than the value of the contract.
Thank you, Mr. Yeglick. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, both of you. Ms. Outman, please, for 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witness for being with us. So I'm kind of new again to this conversation, so I have a lot of background questions, so forgive me. So first I'd like to start with the Task and Solutions Professional Services, so TSPS, consists of two supply arrangements, one for task-based requirements and the other for solution-based requirements. Can you please explain the difference between the two?
Sure. So as you mentioned, they're both supply arrangements, and both of them are eligible for use. They're mandatory tools. And the distinction between the two is ultimately in how the deliverables are stated in the statement of work. And so for the task base, it's very deliverables focused, right? So typically there's a lot of precision associated with the scope of work. In a solutions base, you're identifying a problem, and therefore it gives the contractor much more leeway in terms of how they deliver the solution, but they're ultimately accountable for delivering the solution. So that's the predominant difference between the two.
Okay, thank you. And so can you explain a situation where a contracting authority may change from a task-based supply arrangement to the task-based one, or vice versa? Like, when would that happen?
So again, sometimes the issue is that the client may not be fully aware of their needs and how to actually portray them vis-a-vis a scope of work. So there are certainly instances, as we've identified in the report, where a reconsideration of the procurement strategy is appropriate. So we had an example where an ACAN, or an advanced contract award notice, was contemplated for one of the contracts. It went to an internal review committee. That committee said that they challenged the use of an ACAN and would prefer a more competitive process. So ultimately the procurement strategy was changed in that circumstance from an ACAN to the TSPS task-based. And so documentation was prepared to demonstrate a movement away from an ACAN into a task-based. Now the problem arises on that specific file when, after that was happened, then it was learned that McKinsey was not qualified under the task-based, and there was a change in documentation associated with the solution-based approach, and there wasn't documentation really identifying why that change was made.
Okay, thank you. And so can you also explain the relationship between the TSPS and the centralized professional services system?
So the centralized system is where you have a repository of all qualified bidders. And so the tool is meant to document, in fact, how many prospective bidders are involved in the process. So it's essentially a database, and depending on the value associated with the specific offering, it's the number of specific suppliers that are included as part of the process. So the higher the dollar value, the more open the competitive process.
Okay, and so what role does CPSS play then in protecting the integrity of government procurement?
It plays a significant role in the sense of documentation. So in order to document that you've complied with the business rules associated with the CPSS, you need to retain accuracy in the number of bidders that you ultimately sent the request to. So again, based on dollar value, it would depend on how many bidders should be the recipients of the opportunity. So you also need to characterize on file exactly who it was sent to ensure that those individual suppliers were in fact qualified to bid. And so sometimes we saw examples where we weren't sure whether in fact all suppliers who should have been identified were.
Thank you. And so, the report identified several instances where that documentation was missing or incomplete. So in your experience, what obstacles do public servants face in terms of documenting their decisions? Like, how common would this be?
So this is Mr. Chair, this is a long-standing issue that we've seen in many of our procurement practice reviews. The one distinction that I would note specific to McKinsey is the timing of these documentation lapses. So traditionally, we saw a lack of documentation across the board. But here we saw it at sometimes discrete times within a process where we would have documentation present for certain steps of the process, and then at a seminal moment, then there would be a lack of documentation. And that's the part that's concerning, and that kind of brings me back to the negative inferences that I was talking about.
Okay, thank you. And the report also found that the lack of a statement of work makes it difficult for departments to hold a contractor to account in the event of future contractual disputes surrounding the expectations of work to be completed. As well, this lack of documentation surrounding the specifics of the requirement also creates a risk that contract splitting could go unnoticed as the scope of the original requirement is not clearly documented. So can you please expand on the risks associated with a lack of statement of work?
Yeah, so the question, I'll just situate the question. So it comes from the National Master Standing Offer. And so there was 3 documents that were ultimately required as part of the call-up process, and none of them was a statement of work from the department. So it was a proposal from the proponent, which in this situation was McKinsey, that ultimately drove the call-up process. So without the lack of a definitized statement of work, it's very difficult to say that the performance is either lacking or has been delivered. And so it's in those circumstances where ultimately the government is being led by the supplier, and the supplier provides the proposal, including the pricing, without the grounding of a statement of work, and that's why we found it so concerning.
For sure. And can you also explain that notion of contract splitting that I mentioned and what those consequences would be?
Right. So contract splitting is when...
Sorry, Mr. Yeglick, I'm sorry, we're basically down to 3 or 4 seconds, so perhaps we can get back to it on Ms. Owen's next round. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Yeglick and Mr. Mercereau. I think that your report was very enlightening, but it's also frightening because it's the second time that we are seeing a procurement process that has not followed the rules. And even in your report, if you look at paragraph 36, it says that over the past few years, this has happened quite frequently. Here's my question. Are we dealing with a systemic problem here? Are we dealing with influence peddling, collusion, perhaps problems with training the staff? Perhaps it's all of those things?
I think the answer is a big one, and I was hoping I'd have the opportunity to raise this. We are seeing consistent problems across the federal procurement landscape. If you go back even as far as a decade and further, you'll see many of these issues are repetitive in nature. It's not simply one issue, but what I will say, and this was what I believe the theme for this report is, that perhaps the system has lost confidence in delivering results for the project authority. And so as a result, people are using the system in ways that it shouldn't be used. I don't always like to present problems without solutions, so I will say that our office is currently working on potential solutions to these large standing procurement issues. And if given the opportunity, I'd like to talk about some of those potential solutions.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I will certainly give you the opportunity to do so. But there's a question that comes to mind. And with your proposed questions, I would say that Mackenzie is small. It's big internationally, but when it comes to Canadian government contracts, it's still small. It's bigger than it used to be, but there are companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte Touche, etc., who have a lot more contracts. But if we were to look at perhaps a sample of the companies, you can't take all of them, of course, but if you took a sample of them, do you think you would see the same problems as what you raised in your report?
To answer that, not having done the review, I can't anticipate what I would see in other circumstances. As I mentioned, for the National Master Standing Offer specifically, McKinsey was one of 5, right? So we would anticipate seeing many of the same issues associated with the formation of the NMSO in those other 4 occurrences, but I can't say with certainty because we didn't do those reviews, unfortunately.
Wow. Perhaps you didn't go into this level of detail, but with regard to the public servants, if you look at the people in charge of contracts, do you see the same names coming up with the same errors? Lack of documentation, or is it more widespread?
So the genesis for our review is always looking at the practices of departments, right? And so we're not typically looking to name individuals. But I think recently we have started looking more closely at the names of individuals, departments, programs, etc., to see if we can see trends at that level as well. Here we did not see political influence. We also didn't see many repetitive actors. Obviously, in the formation of the National Master Standing Offer, PSPC was the contracting authority in all of the call-ups, so there was unified kind of analysis done by one group within PSPC for that National Master Standing Offer. So if you ask for community, that's one community that I would identify, or people, as you asked.
Merci.
Thank you. So who is part of that community? Which community are you referring to?
SPC, they have a group who handles these kind of procurements that fall under the National Master Standing Offer. I believe they're referred to the ZM group. That's the acronym that they go by. And then within the call-ups themselves, you would have noticed in the report of the 19 total call-ups or contracts that were issued under the National Master Standing Offer. National Defense had the largest number, and among those, half of them were from one unit, the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture Unit. So there was a concentration of call-ups from that particular unit, as well as for a Digital Navy program and the Canadian Joint Operations Command Unit. So there was some concentration among the contracts.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So I imagine that the analysis of those groups will eventually be done. You might possibly do that.
Views is to ensure that these practices don't continue, and that's the nature of the recommendations we make. So as I've mentioned, the review isn't where it ends. We also conduct a follow-up. So with each of the departments that were subjected to a recommendation, we will go back in and follow up with those departments to test whether, in fact, what has been implemented by the department is meant to address the actual issues that we saw. So once we do that process, we do issue a report card, and we transparently report out on what we saw after the report was finalized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Backrack, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Yeglich and Mr. Mercero. Picking up on where my colleague left off, this issue of there being a systemic problem as opposed to a specific problem with one company is, I think, an important one. And I'm curious, you mentioned that there were 4 other standing offers with a similar structure to the one that was awarded to McKinsey. Which companies were awarded those other 4 standing offers? And if you have the relative value of them, that would be helpful as well.
So the 4 others were Forrester Research Limited, Gartner Canada Co., CEB Inc., Infotech Research Group Inc. And before I give the values, I just want to caveat that how we establish these values is through proactive disclosure. So we know ourselves that there are issues with proactive disclosure, so we don't want to say that these numbers are absolutely accurate, but these are the best that we could identify based on our review. So Gartner by far would be the most significant, coming in at approximately $240 million. Next would be Infotech Research Group at $20.8 million. Then you'd have Forrester Research Limited at $12.5 million and CEB Inc. at $6.4 million.
So my question is, given that you've looked into one company and you found these problems with procurement, and you've extrapolated from that and suggested that there's a systemic issue, what would need to be done to confirm your suspicion that there's a systemic issue with the way the procurement system is being used?
Well, Mr. Chair, the difficulty in answering that question is it's not a specific issue, it's multiple systemic issues, right? And so I do think, and I've used this terminology internally, but I'll share it, I do think the time is now to act. We really need to reconsider federal procurement in its totality. I know it seems like a pretty dramatic thing to say, but I think I've been in this role for over 6 years. I think we've done a great deal of foundational work in terms of what we've seen in the landscape, and I'm fearful that if I don't start acting in a more aggressive manner, significant changes will not come. And I don't think Band-Aid solutions are the answer. I think there needs to be significant rethinking as to how federal procurement is done.
Does part of that rethinking involve looking at how to rebuild the public service so that we're not outsourcing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts to consulting firms that are likely overcharging us for their services?
So we are developing a piece on the potential creation of a chief procurement officer, and that role would have kind of the mandate of looking into foundational changes, including the interplay of various organizations that are currently implicated in federal procurement. But I think if you ask all players or actors in the federal procurement sphere, and they answered honestly, they would tell you that the system does not produce the results that they want in an efficient and timely manner. So I think that
they hack the system, essentially. They have a tool to do a job. The tool doesn't work, so they use the tool in a way it's not designed. Is that?
I think that's a fair characterization.
Okay. What are the next steps from here? How can the committee contribute to this work of reforming the procurement system so it delivers better for the public?
So one identifiable solution that I think is well known within the federal procurement space is the creation of a vendor performance management framework. What that will do is that will actually evaluate the performance in the administration phase of how suppliers are actually performing. Because I do think a part of this is an avoidance of poor performers. So currently there is no federal vendor performance management framework. PSPC is piloting an individualized policy within their department to implement vendor performance management. But like I said, I've been in my role for 6 years, and this is probably my number one priority. I repeat this ad nauseum. I think this is an immediate step that needs to be taken. I think this will help address the poor performers. It will legitimize the process. And again, that I would describe as a medium-term solution. I'm not naive enough to say it's a short-term solution. And the creation of the chief procurement officer in and of itself is not a solution. But it is the first step towards what I would describe as transformational change.
One of my colleagues mentioned that some of these revelations are similar to the ones that we received regarding the ArriveCan procurement. I'm just wondering if you can do a very quick compare and contrast what we saw in that case, what we see in this case.
So I would say that what we saw in that case was we saw favoritism in a different way through what I would describe as transparent favoritism, which was by having overly restrictive criteria. So anyone who looks at those criteria will be able to assess whether, in fact, there is a desired outcome. Here, it's not happening at surface level, it happened below the surface. So the change of procurement strategy wouldn't be made transparent to suppliers, whereas in ArriveCan, I would argue the restrictions were made transparent to other suppliers and they were aware of the restrictive nature, and that may have caused a chill effect in terms of the number of bidders. What I'll also say is the 7 competitive processes that McKinsey won, they were either the sole bidder or the sole compliant bidder in every one of those processes. So that also tells you that on the supplier community, there's something not working, right? So it's not just on the governmental side, it's also on the supplier community side, because if there's a known buyer who pays, why is the community not participating in greater volumes? And so there are legitimate questions to be asked across the board, and that's why I posit the idea that this is the time for action.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Brock, go ahead, sir.
Chair, thank you, gentlemen, for your attendance today. I'm going to share some of the comments of my colleagues in terms of some of the overlap between McKinsey and Government of Canada strategies, also known as GC strategies. And in terms of the focus of the documentation, which in most cases on both sides of the equation were often missing, incomplete, altered after the fact, it really begs the question, and this is something I get continuously and daily from constituents from all across this country, right, is who is actually responsible for this? It's one thing for us as parliamentarians to expose the rot and the corruption in this government, in this broken procurement process. But, where are the consequences? So that's going to be the focus of my first round with you. And the consequences, in my view, ought to be criminal in nature. Because you have a mandate, Ombudsman, I know you do. You mentioned that during your last appearance at OGGO, that if you uncover elements of criminality, and I believe your threshold is a mere suspicion of criminality. Am I correct in that assessment? A mere suspicion of criminality?
So there is nothing formal in either the legislation or regulation in regards to criminality.
Okay.
However, that being said, if we were to see something that would give rise to a suspicion of criminality, we would refer that to the RCMP.
Sure. And your threshold is the lowest rung of the ladder in terms of ultimately until you get a conviction. There's suspicion, then there's reasonable and probable grounds by a police service, then there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt by Crown attorneys, and ultimately a conviction. So a suspicion is a very low threshold. I'm looking at literally the same sort of criminal charges as it relates to McKinsey as the Government of Canada strategies, who the RCMP have confirmed and have raided his house a couple of weeks ago. They're looking at 2 counts, fraud under Section 380 of the Code and forgery under Section 267 of the Criminal Code. So I know that you may not be comfortable in answering this question, but I'm going to put it to you in any event. Do you feel, given your review of McKinsey and the irregularities and the strong presumption against a favoritism towards McKinsey over any other contractor, that there is an element of fraud in relation to the Government of Canada? Yes or no, sir?
You always ask me these difficult questions with only yes and no options.
If it's not a yes or no, I'll allow you to expand.
So I would say no. In this circumstance, what we did see is we saw a bunch of different reference points across different departments, and that's why you see in our conclusion we say in some, right? So within any given department, we didn't see 10 examples of favoritism, right? The only example of communal favoritism, I would say, was in the creation of the National Master Standing Offer, right? It offered an opportunity to contract in a unsolicited way, so where it's directed to McKinsey on a repetitive basis. And so that would be what I would identify as the singular most problematic aspect of this review.
Are you familiar with the definition of fraud under the criminal code?
Yes.
Okay. Everyone who by deceit, falsehood, or other fraudulent means defrauds the public, in this case the taxpayer, of any property, money, in this case taxpayer funds, or valuable security or any service, if it's over $5,000, proceeding by indictment and imprisonment for 14 years. So favoring one particular company, allowing them to egregiously break the procurement rules in non-compliance of numerous statutes, numerous regulations, numerous policies, and in fact, the PSPC themselves published a document calling Doing Business with the Government of Canada, where they highlight openness, transparency, and accountability. In all those circumstances, do you not see a low threshold case of making out that the Government of Canada, through the PSPC and other departments, are defrauding a taxpayer by favoring McKinsey over other legitimate vendors?
Right. And
Could an argument not be made, sir?
And that I have to ask to be a yes or no because we're out of time.
could an argument be made? Yes. Did we see it? No.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Baines, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our Ombudsman and Mr. Mercero for joining us today. I wanted to go back into, you mentioned that the procurement process, this has been going on for decades. You'd like to obviously provide solutions, recommendations. I want to give you that opportunity. But even in previous committee meetings, when we've asked these questions to around procurement, and we've learned that the process has not changed for almost 20 years, and over that time, we've seen people that are continuing to work with departments and people that within government departments have been there for a long time, decades even, and relationships are built, and again, things are happening where you know someone, everybody's, all the people that are getting procurement services all know one another. They interchange. They'll do different jobs continuously, simultaneously. So that whole relationship building, like how much are you seeing of that? Is that and maybe if you can talk about some of the steps that you wanted to take.
Yeah, so absolutely. So there's multiple layers to your question, Mr. Chair, which is, how is federal procurement done? Is there a relationship component to federal procurement? And the answer is absolutely yes, there is a relationship component to this. And that goes back to the point I was making about vendor performance management. How do you actively track this information about who the good performers are and who are the poor performers? And you need to do that in a transparent way. And that's the problem. It's not being done. So you had a particularly bad experience with a particular supplier, and you never want to work with that supplier again. The system currently doesn't have a mechanism by which that could happen, right? So ultimately what ends up happening is then you use criteria as a methodology by which you create an overly specific restrictive criteria to ensure that that specific supplier cannot participate. That being said, I saw the kind of furrowed brow look when I said that there is no process to currently stop that from happening. So obviously, if someone is charged criminally, there are in fact ways to bar suppliers. But what I'm talking about is not of that nature. I'm talking about a supplier who just doesn't deliver in accordance with the terms and conditions of the contract, but nothing criminal, just a poor performing supplier, right? At the end of the day, people want to deliver on their projects, right? And we're not given an opportunity to deliver on their project because the supplier that was hired using the process that they were given ultimately doesn't deliver. It's frustrating for all people. So not just the taxpayer, but also the government officials. And I can speak on their behalf for an instant as well. They're frustrated with the system as well. Not just the contracting authority, but also the project authority, right? The project authority wants to deliver on their project and is being told what procurement tools to use. And if those tools don't lead them to the outcomes that they want, then you have to understand why they're looking at alternatives.
Okay, then what are some of the step-by-step changes you're thinking?
Right. So I think I was kind of identifying two of them, and those are the main two that we've identified as an office to say that these are both significant and would have long-standing impact. So one is the transformational change, and I can't sit before you today and tell you that I have all of the answers. But I will say that I think there needs to be an outside lens looking at what prospective changes need to take place, who's not an active participant in the process. So that's why we're advocating for the creation of a chief procurement officer. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is this government-wide vendor performance management tool, because it will not only eliminate the problem of poor suppliers, but will also reward positive engagements with suppliers. So good suppliers aren't necessarily treated better, but will be given consideration for their good performance on federal government contracts.
And what's that tool look like?
So it's literally called a vendor performance management framework, and it's a transparent government-wide tool where anyone who delivers under a federal contract would be evaluated after completion of the project. There are a number of models that already exist. If you look at other jurisdictions, they would have vendor performance management frameworks. So this isn't something unique that I've created on my own. This is something that's being done in multiple jurisdictions. It's just not being done at the federal level.
And what examples can you give?
I mean, you could even look at the city of Ottawa as an example, but there are multiple examples. And again, I hate to sound like a salesman on this one, but on our website, we've actually published an initial piece on vendor performance management where we have looked at under other vendor performance management frameworks specific to dispute resolution. But we are writing another piece on the Chief Procurement Officer that we hope to publish in the next several months that I would encourage everyone on this committee to read.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Mrs. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Yiglich, in paragraphs 91 and 92 of the report, it says, and I'm going to summarize here, that the EDTs defining the needs are sometimes missing. And in the first document, that's what happened. It's quite scary, really. So I'm wondering if the department really knows what it wants and in what time framework and why. Because if the supplier is saying, well, what do you want, Mr. Government, there's a problem there.
I would agree with your concern with the lack of specific statements of work for call-ups. So that was one of the notations that we had as well. I think part of the answer is in a traditional master standing offer, the good or service would be defined with precision, right? And so therefore what we did see is we saw references back to the generic scope in the creation of the National Master Standing Offer, which in some ways is not wrong. It's actually right. It's just what happens next is the important part. So this wasn't a great fit in our view for a National Master Standing Offer because the services both included aspects of intellectual property, but also the preponderance was not, right? So you saw that 97.5% of the total value of these call-ups was not related to the proprietary tools, but was related to the expert advisory services, right, associated with the tools. So what we question is, if you look at the chart early on in the report, you'll see a shift where McKinsey was winning competitive contracts, and then when the National Master Standing Offer was established, all of a sudden everything becomes non-competitive. So that means that not only were they winning benchmarking prior to the creation of the NMSO, right? They were winning other contracts associated other than benchmarking. After the creation of the NMSO, everything was related to benchmarking.
Merci. C'est ça.
Thank you. That really upsets me because I also see that Mackenzie was tightly linked with the Century Initiative that encouraged people to come to Canada. Now, Mr. Barton said that in committee without having any impact whatsoever, any study of the impact that this suggestion would have. The government seems to have followed blindly. Since it's always Mackenzie that suggested this and the government followed suit, is this a tendency that you've also found in your report?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe so, no.
Mr. Backrack, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Yeglitch, you asked the question, why are other companies not bidding? And I wanted to dig into that a little bit. Is it because other companies know that the system is being kind of hacked to favor certain companies and they don't feel it's worth the effort to participate in the process if the outcome is predetermined?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So part of our role in the office is to speak to all stakeholders. One of the stakeholder groups that we do speak to is the supplier community. So we capture all of the information that they provide to us on a yearly basis. And I will say we had a record number of cases this past fiscal year. What we hear with clarity is they do believe that there is a restrictive nature in the requirements. So whether they be biased or unfair, or overly restrictive, those are constant issues that are raised to our attention by the supplier community. So to answer your question directly, is that happening? Yes, there are concerns on the part of suppliers that there are defined results before a competition is let. So as a result, it diminishes competition. But I also don't think that that's the only factor. And that's the piece where we do need to lift the hood and understand more. Before committee, I represented the statistic of over 5 years where we did an analysis of competitive procurements. In 34 of the instances, there was one sole bidder on competitive processes. So that's a particularly high number. And so our hope is that in future that we're able to look at that number and unpackage also on the supplier side why that's happening. So certainly I know the focus of many of my remarks have been on the governmental side, but I do think there needs to be also an engagement strategy with suppliers to understand why they are not participating in greater numbers, particularly in times of the economy perhaps not behaving as well as one would like.
I'd love to get into the sort of the decision making or the mindset that is leading the people who are responsible for the procurement to repeatedly choose the same vendors and kind of adjust the process in order to have an outcome that results in them working with the same people over and over again. And I'm wondering about the perception of risk. Like obviously there are risks of working with the same underperforming vendor over and over again, which is that, you don't get great results. There's also a risk of dealing with new entrants that you might not have relationships with, all of that sort of stuff. On which side of that risk equation do you see the procurement managers leaning more heavily? Like, are they avoiding risk by favoring underperforming standing contracts versus a more competitive process where you might end up with a wild card that results in a real adverse result?
So, Mr. Chair, I think where you look at restrictive criteria, I believe the correct answer in this circumstance is there is a known supplier who would meet those characteristics. I don't think it's done in the abstract, hoping that an unknown entity can comply with those restrictive criteria. I think there is a specific vendor in mind when restrictive criteria are created.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Genuis, please go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's great to be back at OGGO after an unusually long hiatus. And Mr. Jeglick, thank you for the incredible work you're doing on behalf of Canadians, bringing to light these various significant problems in our procurement system. Your report talks about favoritism. favoritism in terms of the government's treatment of McKinsey, how they favored McKinsey, how they structured systems in order to give contracts to this favorite consulting company of the Prime Minister. McKinsey benefited from this favoritism. And based on the previous work of this committee, it's clear how this happened. Dominic Barton was brought in to chair the Prime Minister's Growth Council at the same time as he was the managing partner at McKinsey. McKinsey analysts did so-called pro bono work for the Growth Council. Andrew Pickersgill, who ran the Canadian operations, supplied the analysts to do the pro bono work. But while he was supplying McKinsey analysts to do supposedly helpful pro bono work for this Growth Council that was chaired by Dominic Barton, he was also selling to the government. And so you have this process where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Dominic Barton are kind of making this connection at the top between McKinsey and the Government of Canada, and then that is clearly filtering out over time throughout the whole system, where the connection at the top was shaping and impacting the kind of procurement that was happening across government to work to the advantage of McKinsey. That led to the establishment of the National Master Standing Officer. I want to ask, just in terms of the analysis you did, about specific individuals involved and what roles they played in getting these things established. So could you speak to Dominic Barton and Andrew Pickersgill, for example, and where they showed up along the way in terms of looking at how this favoritism manifests itself?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So in our review, those names, to my knowledge, did not come up. I'll look to Derek just to confirm, but my belief is that those names did not come up.
I can confirm that Dominic Barton's name did not appear. Andrew Pickersgill, I'd have to go back and review their documentation, but I don't recall seeing that just off the top of my head, but I can come back to you with that information.
Okay, if you could provide some follow-up information in writing about some of the specific individuals. I'm not at all surprised in the sense of Dominic Barton, because I see that connection having been made at the top between the Prime Minister and him, but the selling process happened by Andrew Pickersgill bringing in these analysts. It was the relationship that happened at the top between the Prime Minister and the leadership at McKinsey that then allowed this favoritism to take place. We know as well that there's been a lot of kind of interplay between senior Liberal offices and McKinsey. There's a former member of Parliament in the government caucus that was a former manager at McKinsey. We've had former staff members from the government go to work for McKinsey. What kind of information were you able to identify around sort of political involvement, decisions made by ministers, by ministerial staff that were part of this sort of broader culture of favoritism for McKinsey?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So in the report, we found one example of where a minister approved a contract. It was an ESDC contract. I believe the question came up before you entered the room. But essentially what happened in that circumstance was it was as a result of an internal delegation document within the department that required that contract due to the value to go to the minister for approval. So that was with Minister Tassi for approval. But that would be the only example in our report where we saw any action on the part of a political actor.
Okay, thank you. One of the other issues that frequently comes up with McKinsey is questions of conflict of interest, how McKinsey works for governments and then also works with people who deal with governments. For instance, they work for health regulators, and then they've also famously, tragically worked for certain manufacturers of opioids. In your work, did you see clear instances where they were doing work, for instance, for Health Canada, for other entities in government, where they were also working for companies that the government regulates? I appreciate, part of the difficulty is they have not been willing to give even this committee a client list when requested. But were you able to identify instances of those kinds of conflicts?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So I can answer no, but that's because we weren't looking for that specifically.
Well, just in the time I have left, I just reiterate how important it is, and I think there hasn't been the agreement that I would have hoped for in the past, but how important it is that this committee gets the documents that it had previously requested. There previously had been agreement to order, and we hadn't been able to get in the past.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kuzmierczak, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Mr. Jeglich, for your testimony. Again, you always bring so much information and light and context to this critically important conversation that we are having. McKinsey is a global company that has 40,000 employees around the world. 60 countries, and we see that their clients represent a broad swath of both private sector companies, some of the largest private sector companies in the world, but also governments as well. Recently, the Alberta Conservative government hired McKinsey to do a review of its school policy, schools education system. As well, recently we saw the provincial Conservative government hiring, I believe it was a sole source contract, hiring McKinsey to review its or to provide direction on its pandemic response, coordinating its pandemic response. We're seeing governments of all stripes at all levels, federal, provincial, municipal, hiring McKinsey. Can you provide us with some insight on why McKinsey is successful at receiving contracts at all levels of government and from governments of all political stripes?
Mr. Chair, so obviously I could not comment on why other jurisdictions would be contracting with a specific supplier. But we did see examples in the documentation that they have a good reputation, and that good reputation is ultimately what leads the starting point of the conversation. One clarification I need to make, though, is we're not reviewing the practices of McKinsey. We're reviewing the practices of the departments who ultimately contracted with McKinsey. So I think it is an important distinction. So where we talk about favoritism, it's favoritism on the part of department actions, not on the part of McKinsey.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Your report has been consistent with previous reports. You're finding weaknesses and gaps in terms of justification, as you mentioned, at critical seminal points of when a decision is made to provide a contract. So weakness in terms of justification, written justification for a certain decision. You highlighted the weaknesses in documentation during the process, which would provide us with confidence that the rules are being followed and that it is fair and that Canadians are getting value for money. In your evaluation, did you find fraud?
No, Mr. Chair, no, we did not, to my knowledge.
In your evaluation, did you find corruption?
Mr. Chair, no, I don't believe we did.
In your evaluation, did you find political interference in those contracts?
Mr. Chair, no, we did not. As I mentioned before, there was only one instance in the review that we did where there was intervention on the part of any political actor.
Okay. We talk about benchmarking. McKinsey was brought in for benchmarking. Can you tell us what is benchmarking and what exactly were we benchmarking typically in terms of those contracts?
So I actually asked Derek if he could speak to this one. So I know Derek's prepared to answer this one, but I can fill in some of the gaps if, yeah.
And I won't claim to be the benchmarking expert, but I'll try to cut through a lot of the consultant speak and describe it. So you have a company like McKinsey has clients all over the world, and they run surveys in these companies, and they can ask a variety of questions. The ones that we're speaking about here are mostly around information technology, so the maturity of an organization's information technology processes and procedures, as well as its culture. So in this context, what they do is they They will select what they refer to as their solutions. There's 9 different solutions they offered to the Government of Canada, and they'll administer a survey within the organization. They will receive the responses. They'll do the analysis of those. They'll compare those results against information within their proprietary database, and then they'll provide a report back to the government organization who issued the contract. So that's, in a nutshell, how it's supposed to work. I think what we saw is that they ended up being a lot more than that.
Perfect. That's our time. We'll go to you, Mr. Brock.
I'll take it.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, Mrs. Kusi.
Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to the non-competitive contracts that your office reviewed that were missing conflict of interest declarations from those who reviewed the bid submissions. Something that we've really been focusing on, I think, at government operations as well as public accounts, the aspect of the conflict of interest. So we learned a couple of weeks ago that 38% of public servants who declared a conflict of interest were determined to be in an actual conflict of interest. How concerning is it that this number is already high, yet we seem to be missing multiple conflict of interest forms in many contracting instances?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So obviously, as the member rightfully points out, the Conflict of Interest Declaration is a seminal document, particularly for evaluators. So I believe the statistic you provided was in general, but this is specific to the evaluation of proposals, where I would argue it's even more important to have these declarations on file, and also to bring awareness to the issue. So this is a conversation we had in previous reviews as to whether conflicts of interest would need to be completed by all participants in an evaluation, including public servants. And we've strongly advocated that, yes, all participants in an evaluation should complete a conflicts of interest declaration as a participant. So the fact that they're missing is problematic, absolutely.
We saw that the Department of National Defense has contracted a total of $29.1 million with McKinsey, also noting that they had the greatest number of contracts as well, a total of 12 out of the 19. That's a significant amount, almost 2/3. But we also learned over the past few months that another major contracting firm with defense, known as Dalian, back to my original question, has received millions of dollars from this department and even started working with them while the owner of Dalian, their company, continued to sign the contracts. In this instance, there was no conflict of interest form signed. Due to McKinsey's favored nature, do you feel that there are numerous connections that have led McKinsey to make $29 million from this department? Defense specifically.
So, Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I can't answer that question in terms of the connections. What we saw, we reported out on in the report. In terms of any connections made behind the scenes, I can't speak to.
PSPC stated that they took issue, I used that phrase in my first round, with the assumptions and interpretations of your report, as they were not the same as their department. Do you think a department can simply state their own version of events if they have not bothered to provide any evidence to support their claims?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that was the nature of our discussions with the department. We certainly believe that the version depicted in the report is accurate. In terms of any assumptions made, they were made only based on the facts that were provided. So if there was a fact provided and no fact provided on the other side, then I think we were safe to make the assumptions that we did make. So there were a number of instances where we had discussions with the department to understand their perspective, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve here is factual accuracy, which is why we engage with the department first of all, it's required by way of the regulation, but second of all, we want to make sure that the report accurately reflects the facts. So if there are facts that are wrong, we want those to be corrected before we finalize the report. I think the issue that the department was having was any inferences made as a result. So, you know, a conclusion made on what they saw as unrelated facts, and we saw them as related.
Do you think it's respectful of your work to have a department push back on what you find?
Mr. Chair, absolutely. I feel it's within the department's purview to put forward their view, but then I would implore them to document their view in the future so that when they come forward with what actually happened, that it's reflected in the documentation as opposed to after the fact surmising what may have happened.
Although, I think that's my time. Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much.
We'll give you 10. We'll give you 8 seconds on your next round. Mrs. Binola, oh, sorry. Mr. Jouari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back, Mr. with your colleague. Good to have you back in the committee. So what I've heard so far is our procurement process is quite complicated. It's outdated, and department goes around at times to make sure that they get the job that they're trusted to do. I also heard that there's no evidence of fraud, there's no evidence of criminal activities, no political interference, no mention of the PM or Mr. Dominic Barton, which is good. And then it comes to the question, well, why McKinsey? So the question I have is where my colleague, Mr. Kuzmichuk, started going, and what does McKinsey do? And I heard from Derek that, well, they do technology and culture benchmarking activities. And then we get into, well, what does benchmarking activity means? Means that they look at it, where the department or the organization is, they look at best practices, they figure out where the gap is, they develop a roadmap. So here's my question. If the government of Canada is trying to develop a roadmap of updating their technology and changing the culture and changing the processes, what type of organization should they reach out to at the outset to be able to develop that roadmap for them?
Absolutely. So, Mr. Chair, it's a fair question. I think there are a number of approaches by which you can consult the supplier community in a transparent way to obtain information. I think the approach taken here was to establish multiple non-competitive national master standing offers. As you heard me mention before, there are 5 in total. So that dilutes some of the favoritism that was seen towards McKinsey because there was the creation of 4 other national master standing offers.
Thank you for going there. So you mentioned Gardner. What does Gardner do?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe I'm qualified to answer that. I don't have any specific knowledge, but Gardner is a multinational consultancy.
So Gardner actually is another arm of, let's say, of industry who provides a lot of data, and they develop quadrants, which they say who is at, as it relates to the topic, where they're performing, who are the top performers, what are the best practices, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what does Infotech do?
Mr. Chair, no, I do not.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to stop by not going down the road. But what consistency I see is the complementary role that those 4 and McKinsey played with each other, because what the complementary role is when you're trying to do a benchmarking and when you're trying to develop a roadmap for a transformation of an organization such as Government of Canada, you really need industry best. And coming from a consulting background, McKinsey is one of the best on developing strategy, specifically around IT, specifically around culture. And the other 4 organizations that was highlighted here, they are the one that they can provide a complementary set of data and set of benchmarking to the work that McKinsey is doing. So I think the approach that the Government of Canada has done by making sure that we get one of the best and also making sure that we have other advisory at that level to be able to validate whether McKinsey is telling us and have another pair of eyes, and actually 4 other pair of eyes, it's a wise decision. However, having said all of that, we see inconsistency, and we see that inconsistency around different stage of the process, that we've switched back and forth between following the procurement process and not following the procurement process. And that's where I suggest probably we should focus on. With 30 seconds to go, is there anything that you've seen among those steps that we have, those activities that we have stepped out of the procurement process that would shed some light of why would something like that happen?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I think what we saw concerning in the creation of the National Master Standing Offer was the justification for the exception. So there's nothing wrong with the government wanting the best solution, but it's the methodology used to create the pathway to achieve that best solution. And so here I would argue that there are exceptions under the government contracting regulations, which was cited. So it's 6D, where only one person can perform, which was cited to allow for the creation of the National Master Standing Offer. However, the rationale was limited to the tools that McKinsey offers, right? And so it was rationalization of why we need the McKinsey tools rather than the governmental objective. So the governmental objective should have been the focus, and then saying only one supplier could meet that governmental objective, that would have been an appropriate understanding of the rationalization. But that's not what we saw.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to go back to the statement of work very quickly. When you prepare a statement of work, does the department have to stipulate the need behind the statement of work?
I believe the answer is yes. The work needs to be justified.
Merci. Et est-ce que...
Thank you. And were those justifications present in the file? Usually.
Mr. Chair, I think the answer is that's really the issue that we're seeing, is that the objective of the government wasn't absolutely clear, and the focus was more on the opportunity to use McKinsey tools and why the McKinsey tools were so exceptional, but rather than focusing on what was the government objective that needed to be met.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That certainly sheds a lot of light on the blind approach that the government seemed to approach. It's been like this for years, it seems. They seemed to be blindly confident in someone rather than looking internally for what really would be required. I would like to thank you for your transparency in answering each of our questions. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to file a motion very quickly that the committee invite the Minister of Supply and Services Canada to answer questions of the committee on this study on all of the contracts awarded to McKinsey and Company. The motion was given to the clerk, who will have the opportunity to transmit it to all of my colleagues as well. If you'd like to talk about this at the end of the rounds of questioning, that would be a possibility that I would be open to as well.
The translation that came through as supply, I assume it's the Minister of PSPC? Right. Are you just putting the motion on notice, or do you wish to have it put forward, tabled and debated right now?
Tel que je l'ai dit, je la
As I said, I'm going to table it today. And if my colleagues agree, we can discuss it after the rounds of questioning in order to respect everybody's time allotment.
You have about, well, you have a couple seconds, but we'll go to Mr. Backrack then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to kind of go up to the 10,000 foot level for people who might be watching this committee and wondering what the impact of all this is. We've talked a little bit about the impact on other companies that are seeking government contracts, but there's a public interest here, and I wonder, Mr. Yeglich, if you could talk a little bit about, what having a broken procurement process across all government procurement, what the result is for the public. Average Canadians that are, watching this and wondering what the impact on their lives is.
Mr. Chair, so that's a good question, and it's something that I think is a fair question as well. I think, could we achieve better value for money for the taxpayer if the system worked more efficiently? And the answer is absolutely yes. I think that there's mechanisms in government procurement that need to be reconsidered that ultimately lead to a much more efficient system. Something that we hear, and I hate to use this word because it sounds like a broken record, but simplification, right? And simplification is always used in the context of trying to simplify what exists, right? But you're taking a very burdensome system and trying to make the burdensome system simpler, right? I think there's a different way to approach this problem. So the real cost is time and money, right? So a lot of time is spent on crafting procurement solutions, and a lot of